Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're just going to wait a few more minutes before we start our virtual tour. All right, still letting a few people in from the waiting room. We got a big crowd today. Okay, I believe everyone is in. So hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our virtual talk. Please keep yourself muted throughout this presentation. If you have any questions, we ask that you just type them into the chat at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker will be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, we welcome you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment section on Facebook. We will be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the program as well. Please note that the talk is being recorded and live streamed and will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. If you would like to rewatch this talk or watch previous virtual tours and talks, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Eleanor, to you. Her talk is entitled Albrecht Dürer, Breaking Boundaries. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Kyla. Greetings and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. My name is Eleanor Merle and I'm a docent with the museum and delighted to be with you for today's tour entitled Albrecht Dürer, Breaking Boundaries. Dürer is one of those rare artists whose fame has never gone away. And even today, some of his images are so extraordinarily well known that they're embedded in people's consciousness. We don't realize quite how much he's in the universe until we realize, oh, it's that guy. Dürer was so great an artist, so searching and all-encompassing a thinker, that he was almost a renaissance in his own right. And his work was admired by contemporaries in the North and South alike. People tended to put artists into categories, but Dürer put it all together. The first self-portrait, the first portrait of an animal, the first realistic landscape drawings. Dürer was interested in nearly everything. He really built up an encyclopedia of his own time. Albrecht Dürer was born in 1471 in the German city of Nuremberg. And from the age of 11, he worked as an apprentice under his father, a goldsmith, who taught him the invaluable skills of drawing and engraving that would later prove crucial in his career as an artist. His talent and fame at an early age was also the product of considerable luck. His godfather's support as one of the time's most successful publishers in Germany meant his immediate and easy exposure as a writer and printmaker. And Nuremberg was quite unique as a city in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries because it wasn't wedded to the guild structure that cities such as Antwerp or Florence were dealing with. And so artists had more freedom to work across media, clearly a boon to someone as multi-talented as Dürer. His 3-year apprenticeship at the age of 15 under Nuremberg's leading painter and printmaker, Michael Wohlgemuth, introduced him to the art of woodcuts, the medium he would later excel in. Now, it's likely that the young Dürer was involved in the manufacture of the very famous Nuremberg Chronicle, a huge illustrated world history whose 1,800 woodcut illustrations were prepared by the Wohlgemuth workshop. After completing his apprenticeship, Dürer followed the tradition of young artists and embarked on a guild tour of southern Germany to hone his craft. He returned to Nuremberg in 1494 to marry Agnes Frey, then went off again, this time to northern Italy for a year. When he returned, he did so as a newly independent printmaker and a renowned painter, and opened his own workshop where he focused on the production of woodcut prints. It was Dürer who started the idea of publishing and distributing art. When you think about that, that was quite monumental. Generally, it's thought that Dürer focused more urgently on prints rather than oil paintings because printmaking was significantly easier to produce and much more lucrative. The practice allowed Dürer to solidify his name as an exceptional artist across the continent because his prints were of far superior craftsmanship than any that circulated in Germany. Dürer's first really important undertaking was a series of revelations of St. John, otherwise known as the Apocalypse, a story of extraordinary visions of the end of the world. The detail in these works was unprecedented. The woodcuts in Dürer's Apocalypse sometimes illustrate the text quite literally, while in other cases, the artist interprets, sometimes imaginatively, translating the words and mystical visions into powerful visual images. In the work of other artists, St. John usually appears as a witness to the scenes he describes, but in Dürer's works, he's only included when he's an active participant in the narrative. So in St. John devouring the book, we see the saint on the ground turning aside from his own book and writing implements to literally devour, apparently whole, the entire volume given to him by the angel appearing in his vision. The text says, and I quote, "I saw another nightly angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud and a rainbow was upon his head." Dürer, end of quote. Dürer has shown the angel exactly the way the text describes. His legs are burning columns. One of them stands on the land and the other stands on the sea. His body dissolves into an ethereal cloud. His head radiates light and his right hand points up to the heavens. The artist has elaborated on the vision by adding an altar surrounded by praying angels at the top of the print to symbolize God the Father. In the background, a dolphin-like figure swims into view, while swans and a stately galleon float on the still water. The landscape, which provides the setting for this miraculous vision, includes a wealth of naturalistic details. Grasses and reeds grow in the foreground, and trees close off the composition on the right. The contrast between the calm depiction of the natural world and the saint literally digesting a spiritual message from God enhances the print's dramatic power. Now, throughout his life, Dürer was enthralled to the idea that the perfect human form corresponded to a system of proportion and measurements and could be generated by using such a system. His posthumous treatise on proportions codified his approach in the representation of the human body. with the volume's roughly 150 woodcuts, including full-length studies of men and women in a variety of poses. The artist demonstrated his belief that the human body could be reduced to basic geometrical forms. Dürer first engaged with the topic of proportions following his travels to Italy, where artist theorists such as Leon Battista Alberti and Leonardo da Vinci had worked extensively on the subject. Dürer's fascination with ideal form is manifest in his engraving of Adam and Eve from 1504. The first man and woman are shown in nearly symmetrical, idealized poses, each with the weight on one leg, the other leg bent, and each with one arm angled slightly upward from the elbow and somewhat away from the body. The figure of Adam is reminiscent of the Hellenistic Apollo Belvedere, excavated in Italy late in the 15th century. The first engravings of the sculpture weren't made until well after the date of this engraving, but Dürer must have seen a drawing of it. Dürer was a complete master of engraving by 1504. Human and snake skin, animal fur, tree bark, and leaves are rendered distinctively. But there are some contradictions that run through this picture I'd like to point out. Adam and Eve stand together in a dense, dark forest, far from the garden evoked in Genesis. This forest is distinctly German. The dark woods of the devils and spooks of the Grimm's fairy tales. Foreign and unexpected motifs intrude into this German wood. Despite the chill of the forest, the two human figures appear nude. A seemingly astutely observed tree becomes distinctly odd, as we recognize that Eve is plucking an apple from a tree with fig leaves. A parrot, which is a tropical bird, perches on a branch to the viewer's left. So, well, the answer to these sort of strange images are that the picture tells us primarily about the Renaissance and about Germany and about Dürer himself, rather than the text of Genesis, from which it departs strikingly. The poses of the human figures are contrived to show off this German artist's knowledge of classical proportions. Based on the ideals of the Roman architect Vitruvius, the proportions of the face, for example, the distance from forehead to chin, determining the ideal proportions of the rest of the body. Dürer sacrifices naturalism to showcase his mastery of Vitruvian ideals. So even though Albrecht Dürer's fame was largely built on his prints and graphic style, his financial income was secured with commissions of paintings of both religious subjects and portraits. And the subject that fascinated him above all else was himself. Before Dürer, if artists depicted themselves at all, they kept their images anonymous. By the end of the Middle Ages, artists had begun to show themselves as witnesses or subsidiary characters, as in this work depicting the two smaller donors. Occasionally, they moved to the foreground, as in 1433, when Jan van Eyck is thought to have painted himself in Portrait of a Man. But true to past practice, he didn't label or sell the work as a self-portrait. Then along came cocky young Dürer, who first drew himself at age 13. Working in his father's goldsmith shop, Dürer made this 3/4 length self-portrait, looking at his reflection in the mirror. Keen, well-fed, stringy hair bundled under his hood. He scratched it out in silver point, an extremely difficult medium, since it allows no corrections. Sometime later, he wrote in the upper right-hand corner, and I quote, "This I have drawn from myself from the looking glass in the year 1484, when I was still a child. End of quote, Albrecht Dürer. And do remember, people were looking at very, not very well formed, mirrors, not the mirrors of today, so a lot of distortion. Between 1493 and 1500, Dürer painted 3 self-portraits in oil. In each portrait that followed, he showed himself gaining in stature and elegance. The first self-portrait documents Dürer's appearance at the age of 22. He was probably in Strasbourg at the time, after completing his guild tour of southern Germany, and at the very beginning of his brilliant career. The second of Dürer's 3 painted self-portraits was made in 1498, when he was 26 years old and entering his mature period as a master artist. In 1500, a bolder still Dürer made his stunner self-portrait with fur-trimmed robe. So what do these self-portraits tell us about Dürer, and why did he make them? We're going to go a bit further into each. Portrait of the artist holding a thistle from 1493 was done, as I mentioned, when Dürer was only 22 years old and completing his guild tour in southern Germany. It was painted in oil, not on a wooden panel, as portraits were at the time, but on vellum, probably making it easier to send back to Nuremberg. His goal was not to study himself, but to show himself to others, to demonstrate his outlook and personality to the world. Depicted in 3/4 angle against a dark background, he's a stylish youth wearing a fashionable costume, a bluish jacket with red piping over an embroidered chemise, and a red tasseled hat atop his long blonde locks. The face still has some of the childish features seen in the early drawing of a self-portrait, but the manly neck, the strong nose, and the vigorous hands are already those of an adult. Now, there are a variety of theories about the meaning of the painting, and I'm going to tell you about 2 of the most typical competing, the most prevalent competing theories. Some scholars believe that this work was an engagement present for Agnes Frey, and we showed his drawing of Agnes a few slides ago, and Dürer would marry her the following year. In fact, says the Louvre, the thistle held by the artist is called Mannstroh in German, which also means husband's fidelity. This pledge of love would also explain the elegance of the costume. But the main loophole in this hypothesis that this was an engagement picture is that Dürer may still have been unaware of the marriage, which had been arranged by his father. A rival theory is that the thistle represents the crown of thorns from Christ's passion as a symbol of Dürer's faith. The artist's inscription reads, and I quote, "Things happen to me as it is written on high," end of quote, which can be interpreted as an expression of resignation to his destiny and his parents' will. At 26, 4 years later, Dürer is entering his mature period as a master artist. He's been to Italy. He finished his guild tour. He married. He's now in Italy, was in Italy, and was impressed and gratified by the elevated social status granted the artist in Italy. In Germany, he'd been looked down upon as a lowly craftsman. So the idea of the artist as craftsman was still prevalent in Germany while it was changing in Italy. And I quote, "How I shall freeze under this sun," Dürer wrote home to his friend Willibald Pirkheimer from Venice. "Here I am a gentleman, at home only a parasite," end of quote. Dürer responds and paints himself in the clothes of an elegant patrician, not in the work clothes of an artisan. The hat corresponds to the latest fashion of his time, and the garment with the fine embroidery on the hem was also elegant, because Dürer was fashion conscious and proud. He sheathed the hands that he uses to paint in gray kidskin gloves, indicative of high rank, with the aim of elevating his social status from that of craftsman to artist, and of locating painting among the liberal arts as in Italy. The careful execution of the locks of hair, which appear to be engraved in gold, is evidence of his apprenticeship in the goldsmith's workshop of his father. The artist here chose a half-length, three-quarter format with two focuses of attention, the face and the hands. He located himself in a room that opens onto the outside through a window in the back wall. This follows Dietrich Bout's Portrait of a Man from 1462, a format that was subsequently widely adapted in Flanders and Italy. Basing himself on his flourished format, Dürer added an Italian monumentality in the verticals and horizontals that create the window surround, also evident in the arrangement of his body, which repeats the L shape of the window in the bust, firmly supported by the arm leaning on the foreground ledge. Also present in this work is a characteristic of all Dürer's exquisitely detailed portraits, namely his powers of psychological analysis, evident in the contrast between the sensual features and the cold, penetrating gaze. The inscription on the windowsill reads, quote, 1498, I painted it according to my appearance. I was 26 years old, end of quote. This portrait is above all a declaration of his remarkable mastery. Just 2 years later, at age 28, Dürer created his third and last self-portrait in oil, one of the most unusual and influential works in portraiture history and full of intrigue. Thomas Hoving, the former director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, called the picture, I quote, the single most arrogant, annoying, and gorgeous portrait ever created, end of quote. This self-portrait is of a markedly more mature Dürer than his prior ones. In both of the earlier paintings, he highlighted his fashionable hairstyle and clothing and play on his youthful good looks. It's painted against an almost pitch black background at a time when landscape backgrounds were more common in portraits, as we saw in the last self-portrait, the second. Dürer turned 28 around 1500, the time of this work. And in the medieval view of the stages of life, 28 marked the transition from youth to maturity. So the portrait, therefore, commemorates a turning point in the artist's life. Part of this painting's fame comes from a seeming provocation. Dürer has depicted himself with a striking resemblance to Jesus Christ, or at least to the figure of Christ as known through art history. It was Christ who usually appeared in this front-facing pose. It's not the most flattering pose, but it's very powerful and direct. What did it mean, however, for Dürer to depict himself as the Son of God? The pious have always striven to live in imitation of Christ, though rarely this literally. Dürer left behind many letters and diaries, but he never wrote a word about this self-portrait. Martin Shaw, curator for early German and Netherlandish painting at the Alte Pinakothek, where this painting resides, said in an interview that he believes Dürer painted this work for himself and to show to his artist friends, not for the public. and I quote, because it was so unusual, end of quote. He never sold it, but he kept it in his home until it became the property of Nuremberg City Hall, where it remained until 1805, when it was purchased by Munich's Alta Pinakothek. With this in mind, it's likely that the self-portrait was painted as a virtuoso piece rather than for a client. It was an exercise that allowed Dürer to show off his exceptional observational skills and his technical abilities at depicting textures and facial features, and also how successful he is. Dürer didn't literally think of himself as the second coming. He was as pious as any other German in the years before the Reformation. Where Christ raises his hand in blessing, Dürer points his inward and invokes his God-given gift, the gift of art. And this blockbuster work certainly displays his genius. Look how the lines of his hair weave in and out, how brighter strands and darker ones braid together in each lock. They're so adept that Dürer's rivals suspected he had a special brush. And his big gray-brown eyes, slightly asymmetrical, stare straight forward. You can even see the mullion and transom of a window reflected in the iris of his left eye. They're the eyes of an artist who not only knows how to depict himself, but who considers himself worthy of being depicted. The rich fur-lined coat is an outfit suitable for a nobleman or a scholar, not someone who works with his hands. He's showing off his painterly skill here, picking out every bristle, but he's also affirming that he sees himself as more than a mere technician. And then on the shoulder of his arms, he's got these split leather sleeves that were extremely fashionable at this time. Albrecht Dürer is showing that he's making money from his craft. If we read the picture from left to right, it has Dürer's AD monogram and the year 1500, both in gold paint. And perhaps it's no coincidence that he painted it in the year 1500, the expected year of the apocalypse that was foretold and dreaded in the late Middle Ages. But 1500 was also the first centennial year in Europe that was celebrated. It brought hope, change, and new ideas. So a lot was going on in 1500. Now, if we move to the right, we get Dürer's eyes, and then we get the inscription in Latin, not in German, which is significant as Latin was the language of both the humanists and the Catholic Church. And it reads in translation, quote, "Thus I, Albrecht Dürer from Nuremberg, painted myself in lasting colors, aged 28 years, end of quote," again, using gold paint. It's no accident that these three elements form a straight line that we read across, with the vertical line of the lighting of Dürer's hand and eyes in the center. They form a cross. Dürer was highly aware of his artistic image and his bold signature, his ubiquitous monogram of a large capital A above a smaller d that he placed in a prominent position on all his works, could be considered the very first trademark and brand. As the it boy of the Northern Renaissance, everyone wanted in on Dürer's fame. The practice of forging his work became an epidemic. Even during his lifetime, he was constantly plagued by copyists who tried selling knockoffs. It became such a problem that he took someone to court for copying his prints. This self-portrait was not immune to this fandom. And there was a Nuremberg artist who borrowed it from the Nuremberg City Hall, where it was being kept, as we noted, under the guise of wanting to use it to make a personal copy. And instead, and this is unbelievable, He sawed the panel in half using the newly exposed side to paint a replica of the original. He returned the fake to the city hall and he sold the original to a Munich gallery. Well, he must have done a pretty good job imitating the hand of Albrecht Dürer, because the people of Nuremberg didn't even notice it was a fake until the original resurfaced 6 years later, and they put two and two together. As celebrated as Dürer had become by 1500, he continued in his quest to prove that his work equaled that of the Italian Renaissance artists, focusing also on religious works. In Feast of the Rosary, Dürer creates a harmony between conventional German religious altarpieces and the bright, dazzling colors of Venetian artwork. In a letter to a friend, he stated, I quote, "I've stopped the mouths of all the painters who used to say, good grade to painting, I did not know how to handle my colors. Now everyone says the better coloring they have never seen," end of quote. Feast of the Rosary was commissioned by a group of German merchants, and the artwork was created to be displayed at San Bartolomeo Church in Venice, an area with a huge population of German immigrants. The central figure in the Feast of the Rosary, we have the Virgin Mary and a young Jesus Christ. Surrounded by cherubs, the Virgin Mary is in the process of handing rose garlands to her followers. To the left, we see representations of the clergy led by a kneeling Pope Julius II. His tiara is on the ground as he's preparing to receive a rose garland from Christ. He is most likely included in the piece because he was the one who approved the German Brotherhood of the Rosary in 1474. Emperor Maximilian can be seen on the opposite side being crowned by the Virgin Mary. Like the Pope, he's removed his imperial crown to receive her blessing. The Pope and the Emperor were seen as the supreme authority in the Catholic world. This work is heavily influenced by Dürer's time in Italy, and in particular by the work of Bellini. In fact, Dürer was noted as saying that he wanted to equal or even surpass Bellini, combining inspiration drawn from Bellini's work with Dürer's own mastery of painting. And it's believed that Dürer was particularly inspired by Bellini's San Zaccaria altarpiece. Notice the single angel who sits at the Virgin's feet playing a lute, an evident homage to Giovanni Bellini's altarpieces. Beyond obvious comparisons, such as the style of the cherubs and the surrounding crowd, both Feast of the Rosary and San Zaccaria altarpiece use natural light to illuminate their subjects, something often seen in Bellini's work. Dürer wasn't aiming to copy the Italian style directly, but to take certain elements and create a union between Northern and Southern influences. The single angel sitting at the Virgin playing a lute is an evident homage to this and similar altarpieces by Bellini. Now, it was not unusual for artists of this time to insert their own image in multi-figure compositions. And here, as the only figure in the painting directly facing the audience, we see Dürer portraying himself on the right side, again in magnificent attire. In his hands, he holds a cartouche with a short inscription reporting that Albrecht Dürer completed the painting in 5 months. In actuality, it took 8 months. It was important for Dürer to prove to the doubting Italians that in painting, he was as good as in engraving. Speaking of altarpieces, we'll now take a closer look at perhaps the most recognizable and reproduced work by Dürer, the pen and ink drawing of praying hands. This image is the most widely reproduced depiction of prayer in the Western world, found on posters, coffee mugs, mobile phones, and used as album artwork. Justin Bieber has a reproduction of the image tattooed on his left leg. We even find Dürer's praying hands on Andy Warhol's tombstone. The original conclusion, which is accepted for many centuries, was that Dürer completed this drawing as a preparatory study for an altarpiece. But in recent years, this theory has been thrown into doubt. A new opinion formed from considerable research is that it was, in fact, part of a campaign by the artist to promote his technical talents to potential suitors. Again, as we saw in his self-portrait of 1500, these would be works he would have around his studio. In the 1930s, a fable arose that the hands in the sketch, a fable postulating they were the hands of the artist's brother, which were worn from hard work. But it's much more likely that the artist modeled the drawing on his own hands, and we could see similar hands throughout his work. Yet another of the media and themes Dürer excelled in were the studies of nature done in watercolor. Much of Dürer's artwork from the early 1500s, including a young hare, expresses this interest. Dürer's nature pieces are famously detailed. Young hare is, however, not simply a scientific study of an animal. The work contains an innate tension created by the contrast between the subject and its depiction. A hare is a notoriously restless animal, fleeing when approached closely. The artist has captured the hare in a fleeting moment of stillness. The slight turn of an ear and the eye that's fixing the viewer, however, indicate the animal has noticed us. Its hind legs are bent, ready to jump. Dürer worked in an age when religious symbolism still dominated everything, from folk art to state ceremonies. Few artists would have depicted any animal without a familiar system of allegorical cross-references. But Dürer's hare can be simply itself, and that may be part of its enduring popularity. The prominent monogram and date suggests that Dürer considered this a finished and valued work, rather than merely a preparation for a later painting. We'll close our tour today with a very influential religious work done toward the end of Dürer's life. Toward the end of his life, when Dürer was in the Low Countries, he made a single painting that had a huge impact. And this is the painting of Saint Jerome. By that point, he had painted so many old people, and he could have just told himself, I know how to do this. But no, he worked from a model, and he got himself a 93-year-old man on the streets of Antwerp. This is not a Jerome who's remote from us. It's someone who looks at you very intensely and actually becomes a challenging figure with his hand on the skull. The emphasis on the saint's asceticism and spiritual interiority suits the memento mori theme. The skull presents the specter of death. And this image had a huge influence. Other artists must have seen it, and they made their own versions of it by the dozens. Here are two such examples, one by Marinus van Rijmonswijk and the other by Hugues van Cleve, both contemporaries of Dürer. One of the forefathers of the early Roman Church, Jerome was exceptionally learned and perhaps the greatest of the church doctors. His translation and revision of the Latin New Testament and his version of the Old Testament became the standard text of the Bible in Western Europe. Jerome was admired for his knowledge of Greek and Hebrew and an active participant in politics of the church. By placing Jerome in a study setting, Dürer was following the established convention, portraying him as the archetypal scholar. The various objects placed in proximity to Jerome were common symbols, each with recognizable significance. The skull, as we mentioned, represents the seat of thought and symbolized spiritual perfection, in addition to a memento mori, or remembrance of death and the fleetingness of life. Death of the physical body, symbolized by the skull, enabled one to be reborn at a higher level at which the spirit could rule. Perhaps the most appropriate symbol for Jerome is that of the book which lies open on the table, symbolizing knowledge and wisdom, the two traits for which Jerome was most admired. The fact that the book lies open indicates that the mysteries of the universe could be understood by Jerome. Albrecht Dürer was a remarkable man, a humanist, scholar, philosopher, and intellectual, with an interest in literature and nature, as well as many forms of art. He left an incredible cultural legacy for humanity. The epitaph on his grave reads, and I quote, "Whatever was mortal in Albrecht Dürer lies beneath this mound," end of quote. A suggestion of his superhuman status that I think you'll agree is well deserved. This brings our tour to a close. I hope you enjoyed our journey through Dürer's life and work, and I welcome any questions or comments you may have. Thank you all.
And thank you, Eleanor, for once again a wonderful presentation. Yeah. Anyone have any questions? Feel free
Yes,
to unmute.
this is Dee Dee. I just asked her to repeat the quote from the, it was about 2 pictures back, the rosary thing. The sound went at that point, and it was very long and drawn out and then caught up, but I missed the quote. If I could have a repeat.
Further back than this, Dee Dee?
Oh, yeah, yeah. This is where the rosary picture, the rosary.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Let me.
Further back?
Yes, the rosary picture. The one on
rosary.
the piece of the
Oh,
rosary with
sorry.
the crowning with the roses. That, yeah, you quoted something here, and
Yeah.
and I missed it. I'm sorry. I
No,
couldn't.
no, let me
Uh-huh.
find it. Oh, yes. He quoted in a letter to a friend, he stated, "I've stopped the mouths of all the painters who used to say I was good at engraving, but as to painting, I did not know how to handle my colors. Now everyone says the better coloring they have never seen."
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah, I didn't catch the first half. Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you. Okay.
And it is interesting. We have much writings. He left so much writing that tells us about him, and yet he, as the curator at the mentioned for this self-portrait, he just said nothing. So
Oh,
he
yeah,
wanted to leave it to our interpretations.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, Dee Dee, thank you.
I see that we have another question in the chat, which is, how old was he and where did he die?
Oh, okay. He lived from 1471 to 1528. So fairly young. He did die in Nuremberg. That's where his statue is. He was born in Nuremberg and he died there. He traveled a great deal. There was a show at the Met, I believe, not long ago called, I think, Journeys of Dürer. And I wish I could have made it because it pretty much followed him in his journeys and his artwork along the way. His marriage, of course, I didn't go into this, but his marriage, which was arranged to Agnes Frey, was pretty much known to be not a very happy one. And I think he spent time traveling as a way to stay away from home.
We also have another question, which is how many paintings did he do?
Oh my goodness, I do not know. I do not know the answer to that. He is, remember he has woodcuts, and you've got, lots and lots of versions of woodcuts and engravings. So I think, and remember, he wanted to do woodcuts because he could spread, his works throughout the world. So my understanding was he was extremely prolific. Again, more in wood prints and engravings, but he earned quite an income from his paintings.
I guess also kind of on the same note of his personal life, do you know if he had any children?
He did not have any children. I think, again, that speaks to his very unhappy marriage.
Mm-hmm. Is there a book you would recommend on this subject?
Boy, I looked at so many. There was not one that I referenced so many, and so much of it was, online, that I honestly can't come up with one. There are many brilliant works. So it really depends on what you're fascinated with, because there are those that just address woodcuts, those that just address engravings, paintings, those which, place him within the Northern Renaissance and other Northern Renaissance artists. So it really depends upon, the focus you're interested in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Actually, I have one personal question, which is about the portrait we have up on the screen right now, which is just, obviously you wouldn't know the exact answer to this, but what do you think the public's reaction would have been had this portrait actually, like, people been able to see it?
I'm not sure what you mean, Kyla. People have been able to see it.
Well, because you had mentioned that you.
Oh, you mean at the time? Yes, at the
yes.
time. Yeah. Well, there's conjecture it would have been blasphemous, and how it would. My research showed, of course, that how it would have been viewed would have varied based, on time. In his own time period, as I mentioned, it was not unusual for people to think of themselves, as being in the image of, God. But I would think it would have been blasphemous. But that's an excellent question. It didn't come into view until the early 1800s, when it went into the Nuremberg town hall. And even then, it created quite a furor, of people being upset by it. And it's rather, you don't realize it's rather a small painting. And I saw a vision of how it's placed in the Alta Pinakothek Museum. And it's really among a whole wall of paintings. It's not like they have it highlighted itself. Oh, someone is saying, visit his home. If you go to Nuremberg, it's a great museum. Oh, how wonderful.
We also have another question about which Italian painters he tried to or emulated besides Bellini.
I think it was the other way. Well, he did travel to Italy, and as I mentioned, I would say Bellini was his. I showed the church altar, and he very much wanted to, paint like Bellini. He, in turn, was a great influence on the subsequent, Renaissance artists. I think I think he was almost more of an influence on, subsequent Renaissance than he was influenced by the Renaissance in Italy.
Very interesting. Okay, we also have somebody asking what do you think about the book Albert and the Whale?
I don't know that book. What is
Okay.
it?
I unfortunately do not know that one as well.
Can the person, Courtney, tell us about it?
Yes, I'm a docent at the San Diego Museum of Art next door to you guys, and it is the book we are currently reading in our art museum book club. And it's probably the oddest book that I have ever read. It's so strange. So it's not a straightforward biography of him at all, but he's the whole influence behind it. And the reason it's called Albert and the Whale, and maybe you could speak to this for us, is that he evidently was fascinated with whales. And he made trips to see them when they got washed up on the beach. So that this was a passion of his, animals in general, as we see in The Rabbit, but also whales specifically.
Yes.
But he also wheels in Thomas Mann and the influence he had on Thomas Mann. So, it's just a very interesting take on talking about Dürer.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, again, time limited. We couldn't look at all his works, but yes, he was searching for a whale, and you would definitely know his iconic image of a rhinoceros, which is a wood print of the rhinoceros. He never saw a rhinoceros. He never, he was traveling. I believe that your book is referencing a time when he was traveling to, I think, Africa to try to look at a rhinoceros, and he capsized. He never saw the rhinoceros, but from hearsay and other images, he painted what was, again, become an iconic image of a rhinoceros.
Yes, and it actually looks like a rhinoceros. Like, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, well, I think we've answered all the questions and gotten to talking about rhinoceroses and whales. We just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. We also hope that you guys can join us again next Thursday for another one of these virtual tours. And in addition, if you'd like to attend an event in person at the Timken, our August 14th event is the Wine and Masters event with wine expert Rod Phillips. And this is a two-part event with first a lecture and then a wine tasting, which promises to be very fun and entertaining. And if you want more information on that, we just ask you visit our website event tab. So thank you once again to Eleanor for an amazing
Thanks,
tour
everyone.
presentation. Mm-hmm.